All right, the House is back. The opposition attacks, the government defends, and oh yes, the deficit seems to be going up. Andrew's in Toronto, Chantal is in Montreal, and Maclean's national columnist Paul Wells joins us from Ottawa tonight. All right, Andrew, you start us. Does it matter that the deficit is, they're setting the groundwork anyway for it to be higher than what they had suggested it would be, or what they promised, I guess it would be in the campaign?
It doesn't matter a whole lot economically, assuming that we're within some kind of margin of $5 or $6 billion. On the other hand, that's $5 or $6 billion in 7 weeks in government between the revisions of the Finance Department and then the revisions that the Parliamentary Budget Officer came out with. If they stick to the planned spending that they said they were going to do, we're somewhere up at the $15, $16 billion mark. And I guess the troublesome aspect of it is, if originally they freed themselves from the constraint of balancing the budget, they've now freed themselves from the constraint of hitting the $10 billion target. Now they say, well, we're going to keep the debt to GDP ratio going down, but there's no particular reason to believe that they're any more likely to hit that target if they're that unconcerned by it. So I guess the question becomes, what does constrain them and what is their bottom line? And at this point, I don't think we really know.
Chantal?
And that is the question on everyone's mind. At what point, where is the line when they start looking and they say, we're not going to continue along this path, we're going to retreat from some of the promises or push them back, because this is where our line is. A lot of people understood that $10 billion annual deficit to be a ceiling. Over the past 2 weeks, it's become a floor for annual deficits. And I'm guessing that a lot of people would like to have more of a sense of where that ceiling now is.
How much of this is their problem and how much of it is, the system's problem? Paul, you've written in the past about the need for some kind of independent body that says, okay, these are the state of the finances, make your judgments based on these.
And for a while, I thought we actually had one. It was the Parliamentary Budget Office. You're right, more than a decade ago, I suggested that there should be some body that is independent from government and from other political parties that gives an accounting of the state of the fisc, at least before every general election, so that everyone's got to go from the same assumptions and the same numbers, and that they won't be able to do what every new government always does, which is to say, I'm astonished that the numbers aren't what we thought they were. The Conservatives, to their credit, set up the Parliamentary Budget Officer, kind of. They didn't really cooperate with them. But in the last election, almost the only thing the Parliamentary Budget Office hasn't done in recent times is give an authoritative statement of the state of the books, which would have been really helpful and might have kept the Liberals from putting their thumbs on the scale the way they seem to have done.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could even go further. I mean, if you look at the kind of authority that the Congressional Budget Office has in the States, that the UK equivalent has in Britain, they become the repository of this kind of information, and governments go to them for the information rather than them having to go to governments and say, pretty please, would you tell us what you're going to spend next year? And that way, everybody can work off the same set of numbers. And I don't see why we can't implement something similar here, rather than, as Paul said, having this game being played. And by the way, it's a game in which both the governing party and the opposition at election time are kind of complicit. It suited the Liberals' purposes to pretend that the Conservative numbers were somewhere in the ballpark, even though they came out with something slightly different. But they both want to pretend that things are perhaps better than they are, which makes it doubly insincere when the new government claims that they're so shocked by what they've found.
Chantal, you wanted to add something there?
Well, in this particular situation, there are two elements that could go to a perfect storm. Everything we just talked about numbers, and it was kind of predictable that the numbers maybe wouldn't totally match, given that the Conservatives really wanted to go in an election claiming that they'd resolved the deficit. But at the same time, you've got a declining revenue situation for the federal government that stems from what has been happening to the resource sector. And that is real, and it is not getting better. So it's kind of a combination. Not only are you left with books that have more red than you expected, but how do you adjust, or when do you adjust your plans to a reality that is deteriorating rather than improving on the revenue side?
I want to switch to a different topic here, and it's to do with appointments. I find this story interesting on a number of different levels, but let's start by just giving what's happened so far. There are a lot of appointments where, well, not necessarily a lot compared to the number of appointments that are available to any government, but more than a few dozen near the end of the Harper term, before the election, And many of these appointments take effect, they haven't even taken effect yet. Some are still to come and last for years into the future. Now, the Liberals have decided they want those people who were appointed, in many cases Conservatives, to not accept these appointments or to turn them back in. This is what Dominic LeBlanc, the government House leader, had to say the other day. Watch this.
This constituted an abuse of power by the previous government. The process that was followed did not bear up to scrutiny, including parliamentary scrutiny for these 33 individuals. So we hope that they'll do the right thing, remove themselves from those offices, and allow a more open and transparent process to fill those positions.
Well, as of tonight, I'm not aware of anybody offering to step down. That may have happened, but I haven't heard of that yet. Was it, let's take the premise of what Dominic LeBlanc said, was this an abuse of power, Paul?
It was a creative use of power, I think. I wouldn't go as far as Mr. LeBlanc is implying. Look, if these people are improperly in their position, they can be removed through the same sort of process that he describes. And apparently that's not possible, so they're asking them to step aside. But yeah, this is Stephen Harper. This is essentially an extension of comments he made before the 2006 election when he said, look, this town is lousy, I'm paraphrasing, this town is lousy with liberal judges and bureaucrats, and a couple of conservatives here and there won't make much difference. He's essentially decided that he can't unappoint the Supreme Court, he can't unappoint you and me, Peter, but he can reappoint some people who do like him, and so that's what he decided to do.
Chantal?
I didn't, but that's a principle, and I think there was some of that thinking behind it. But looking at the list, I'm not sure I see a devious purpose in planting Conservatives in strategic places that will be harmful to the government in these 33 appointments. I don't know why any of them was so qualified that they needed to be reappointed, but I'm not sure that I saw why most of them were so not qualified that we need to ask them to renounce it.
Where are you on it, Andrew?
Well, I think that Harper stretched a convention rather than necessarily breaking it. It is not unknown for governments in their last months to appoint people into the future. Jean Chrétien did it, Paul Martin did it. They just didn't do as many, and they didn't project them quite as far into the next government's mandate as this one has. And so it's objectionable, I suppose, in that sense, that they've gone further than previous governments have done. The Liberals, for their part, have now invented a new convention, which is that incoming governments can without actually going through the due process of removing people, can just kind of demand that they resign their posts and sort of shame them into it. And as you suggested, not many of them seem to have taken them up on that. I guess what I come away from this is, what is the rule here? What is the going too far? Maybe we need to specify, is it 30 days into the next government? Is it 100 days? I think we need to have some sort of a better guide for this than what either one government thinks they can get away with or the next government thinks they can make a hue and cry over.
I suppose you could always argue that now that there are fixed date elections, that there would be a period before an election where you say no appointments can be made. Is this like you had the famous you had an option situation in 1984? I mean, they were much more obvious political patronage appointments that Pierre Trudeau's government made in the last days before John Turner took over the government. Is this similar or is this very different, Chantal?
I would have found it similar if Stephen Harper on June 30th had filled 22 Senate seats. Which didn't happen. And I would have seen that as kind of a devious way to leave people behind to make it hard if you lost the election. I'm not sure I saw in that list that kind of thinking.
The other level, and Andrew kind of hinted at it here, there are a lot of appointments that are made by any government and at the Prime Minister's discretion. Senior appointments within the public service, and those can be overturned by, I guess, any prime minister at any time, like deputy minister positions, but also heads of crown corporations and other positions like that. Now, there used to be this, I guess it was a myth, because I don't see any evidence of it, that when there's a change of government, those positions, those people in those kind of positions actually put forward a resignation letter, and then it's up to the prime minister at his discretion whether accepted or not accepted. There doesn't appear to be anything like that, and one wonders whether or not there should be. Paul?
I think it's important to reiterate that the stakes are not super high here. These are not Tory fat cats living high off the taxpayer hog. Most of these positions are essentially honorary. They're not richly remunerated. And I think it goes back to what that comment from Mulrooney. You had a choice. You could have said no. That durably spooked, not 100%, but it dimmed the ardors of future prime ministers going forward. When I was at the National Post in the last years of Chrétien's term in office, we started gleefully counting every patronage appointment he made. And to our great disappointment, we couldn't get the number to go very high. He put his chief of staff, he put his comms director in the Senate, but then he kind of stopped. And I think it's because Mulrooney showed that there can be a political cost for that sort of behavior.
Andrew?
I do think that, as both of my colleagues have said, I think the quality of the appointments matters here. There'd be more of an outrage factor if there was more sort of grotesquerie in some of the choices. I would not want to go down the road that perhaps you're suggesting, Peter, of a kind of incoming government just cutting a swath through the civil service or through the crown corporations. That is much more the American tradition, kind of a spoil system. And maybe it sounds naive, but I prefer that we try to maintain some sense of a nonpartisan professional civil service, and I include the crown corporations and agencies in that. You're never going to get it perfectly that way. There's always going to be exceptions, but I would hate to see us go down the road of just mass layoffs and incoming governments just keep appointing all their cronies.
It would be really inconvenient for Justin Trudeau if our ambassadors to France and Great Britain had to resign before he dropped in on them. Just saying.
Yeah. Neither one of them seem to have a long time left in their terms anyway.
I think they do understand that whichever way you look at it, they can start thinking of where they'd like to live in Canada.
All right, we've got the House rises tomorrow after a 1-week run here, as everybody, the MPs all head back to their ridings for the holiday break. It does give us, once again, an opportunity to say, okay, it's a new government. They've been in store. They've done a lot of different things. They've had some issues and challenges, some of which we've already mentioned here. But overall, what's your take on this government? Paul?
Very activist, moving quickly. In one short week in Parliament, they've had announcements on missing and murdered Aboriginal women. They've got 2 planes coming from Syria with refugees. They've adjusted their line on budget deficits. They're moving ahead with electoral reform, kind of pell-mell. And yet there's a lack of urgency. They don't seem kind of emotionally hot or too worried about things. When Bill Morneau has a bad day, the finance minister has a bad day over deficits, there's not this rush to change the channel or to hang someone else out to dry. There's a kind of acceptance that you're going to have good and bad days, which I think will wear well with this government.
Well, we'll see how long that lasts. Chantal?
I think that comes in part because some of the people in the PMO have actually worked in office with premiers, Queen's Park in this case, and they know this, that not every day, you can't win every day. The issue is to go on to win the next day or the day after that. I watched the House of Commons, and I have to say that I watched the tandem of Rona Ambrose and Lisa Raitt on the Conservative side lead the official opposition. I asked myself 2 questions. One, why didn't Stephen Harper give people like that more room and more space? And 2, it's an interesting paradox in front of a government that claims to have gender parity in cabinet, that it is women on the official opposition benches who are questioning the top-level ministers who mostly happen to be male.
You get the last word, Andrew.
Well, I think Paul makes a very good point that there is more of a sense of self-assurance, a less tendency to sweat the small stuff and have your hair go on fire because of some one-day story, and that speaks well to them. I think Chantal's right. That's partly the experience of the people around Trudeau. I think it's also to some extent a projection of his own take on things, his own personality. The downside of that, the flip side of that, is they also don't sweat the significant details all too often, and a lot of these policies give evidence of having been kind of either improvised on the fly or, thought up on a day because they seem like a good symbolic statement or that kind of thing. And then we find, as we get into them, that maybe they need to be thought through a little bit more than they have.
All right, and leave it at that. Good discussion. Paul, great to have you with us. Chantal and Andrew.